I want to add my voice of sympathy and condolences to everybody who has buried a loved one in these most heartbreaking of circumstances. I want to acknowledge, and I think it's important to acknowledge, that from the start the right model and approach was adopted in response to this public health emergency, and credit is due to everybody for that. The approach being test, isolate, trace. And to do that in a comprehensive manner. Also, the advice given by way of public health notice to the general public to stay connected but to stay physically apart, to the hand hygiene, all of that has, I believe, been an outstanding success. The emergency measures and restrictions that have been introduced have been very, very difficult for people, for families. Some are really struggling with them, and I think we need to acknowledge that. But the country and communities have rallied magnificently. And of course, our frontline staff in particular, and particularly within the health services, are again to be congratulated and thanked. And of course, the best way that we can thank them is to pay them well and to respect their work, not just in the heat of an emergency, but always. We've made extraordinary asks of people, and we will continue to ask that precautions are observed. And therefore, it has been most unhelpful that members of government have engaged in thinking out loud and kite flying, and created nearly an impression that May 5th was a red letter day when we would all be liberated from these restrictions. That caused confusion. I think it was unfair, and I think it was doubly unfair, having done that, to then criticise complacency and to almost point the finger at the public or sections of the public. So I hope we won't have a repeat of that. I very much welcome, Taoiseach, and you might confirm that tomorrow you will in fact set out the roadmap ahead. I think, having made extraordinary asks of the public, of our people, we have to, at a minimum, do them the respect of giving them clear, comprehensive information, and doing so very transparently. I want to raise a number of issues with you, Taoiseach. The first is testing and tracing. We now have a target of 100 tests per week. I would like you to confirm for the Dáil that that target will be met, and you might set out how it will be met. I'm mindful that announcements have been previously made and citing very large, ambitious targets, and it never matched actually what was happening on the ground. So, at what point and at what date will we have the 100,000 tests? Will that happen in real time? And will we have the tracing to match and to complement that? I want to raise with you also protection for vulnerable groups, which you cite as the second condition for any easing of measures. I have to say to you, if we look at what's happening in our nursing homes, you could not be confident that we have the provisions, resources and protections necessary for that very vulnerable group of people. So when will nursing homes have enough staff? When will they have adequate personal protection equipment? When will the testing of nursing home staff and residents be completed?
I've counted more than that, but I'll get straight into answering them. Just the question about the roadmap for reopening Ireland and the roadmap to new normal. Yes, it is our intention to share that with the public tomorrow, but that is subject to the outcome of an NEFID meeting in the morning and subject to a cabinet meeting in the afternoon, so not entirely under my control. The target capacity for testing is 100,000 a week. Again, I want to emphasise it's the capacity to do 100,000 tests a week. It's not a target to carry out and do 100,000 tests a week. The number of tests that's done per week will depend on the number that are needed and will depend on the clinical criteria and other matters. So we won't be looking to test 100,000 people a week. We'll want the capacity to test 100,000 people a week. And as I mentioned earlier, we're already in the top 6 in the European Union in terms of testing per head, and well ahead of many other countries that are cited as being the models for testing, like Germany, for example. On nursing homes, as I mentioned in my speech, I'm informed that PPE deliveries are now regular, and we do want to know if there's any issues in any particular nursing home that isn't getting PPE. Testing is largely complete. Again, bear in mind the plan is and was to test nursing home staff and also residents in all nursing homes, but not necessarily all residents in all nursing homes. Because if there is a nursing home that hasn't had the coronavirus, there is a risk in bringing somebody into it to carry out the tests. So you need to make sure that you get that right clinically. I think they were the questions.
Taoiseach. So this is a problem now. The announcement was made of 100,000 tests per week. And the presumption is that, of course, you have to do that, you have to have the necessary capacity. But certainly, I believe the correct thing is for this 100,000 tests to be real tests and not some just notion that we say theoretically we have the capacity to do this. You will know, Taoiseach, as well as I, that from the very, very beginning of this pandemic, the international advice, the best scientific and medical advice was test, 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 then isolate, then trace, trace, trace. I believe that it is very, very dangerous to propose unwinding emergency measures in the absence of comprehensive testing. And that means the 100,000 tests have to be real tests. It can't be a target. It can't be an aspiration. It has to be 100,000 tests that go through the laboratory and that get the results in a timely fashion back to the person concerned. And I'm very worried today that on the brow of announcing your roadmap out of the emergency measures, which we all want to see, that there is still a reticence, a lack of ambition, a lack of intent in terms of the extent of testing that we need. I'm sure you're not going to challenge the view of the World Health Organization and others which say that you must test, test, test. And how do we keep our population safe in the absence of that very comprehensive testing? So I'm troubled, I'm concerned, Taoiseach, for you to confirm on the floor of the Dáil that this is an aspirational target to build capacity rather than to carry out the tests. And I want to put it to you that testing to the extent of 100,000 a week is necessary, because we need to know where the virus is. That's what all the experts tell us, because it is only by knowing where it is in the population that you can actually isolate and do the tracing. There's a contradiction in the position of government and the system, because we have heard talk saying, well, we're going to test asymptomatically, but people with no symptoms. I mean, that strikes me as a wise approach. But it is in total contradiction to what you have set out here. So, Taoiseach, can I put it to you that the 100,000 tests should be real tests? It shouldn't be an aspiration or a target. And can I ask you to take actions to make sure that that is in fact the case?
Thank you very much. Taoiseach, to conclude on this matter.
Thanks, Deputy. There's no big reveal here. This has been on the record for days, if not weeks. The target is to have the capacity to carry out 100,000 tests per week and to have a good turnaround time in doing so. We're not going to carry out random testing just so we hit 100,000. The target isn't to carry out 100,000 tests. The target is to carry out as many tests are necessary, and we believe that we need a capacity of 100,000 to be able to do that. So we're not going to carry out random tests just to get to 100,000. If we ever do random testing, it'll be a seroprevalence survey, and we'll only do a seroprevalence survey when we have a serological test that is up to scratch, that can actually do that and give us useful results. We're not there yet. The tests that have been the tests that have been developed, the antibody tests, are not up to standard. And you may have seen the HTA produced by HICWA, which goes through that in detail. But we may have, and Roche may as well, but they haven't yet, Deputy. And we're not going to use it. And unlike other countries. I don't want to answer Mary Deputy McDonald's question. You didn't leave any time to ask any. Sorry. We may get to the point in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months where a company does produce a serological test which works, in which case we would be raising the 100,000 to a much higher level. But that test doesn't yet exist. And in terms of the number of tests, that's based, as always, on the clinical criteria.